The knock came on a Tuesday morning when Murphy was sweeping leaves that didn't belong to her from a courtyard that didn't welcome her. She'd been living in the abandoned stone house for exactly 3 weeks and 2 days. Not that she was counting. Widows don't count time in days. They count it in hunger cycles, in how many times their children ask for food, in the precise mathematical equation of how long money lasts when there is no money to begin with. The house sat alone at the edge of the valley, a 3-story monument to decay built sometime during the Ottoman era, or so the people in the village said when they spoke about it at all, which wasn't often. Most didn't speak about it. Most crossed themselves when they passed the road leading up to it. Most whispered that it was cursed, that women who went there disappeared, that children who played in its courtyard developed strange silences, that the stones themselves were hungry in ways stones shouldn't be. Murphy didn't care about curses. Curses required belief, and belief was a luxury item she'd traded in for survival the day her husband failed to return from the north. That had been 8 months ago. 8 months of watching her daughter's cheekbones become architecture. 8 months of collecting copper coins from washing other women's clothes, money that evaporated before it reached her palm. 8 months of being something less than human in a village that had decided long ago that a woman without a man was simply a problem that hadn't yet solved itself. Don Hassan, the man who owned everything, including the debt her dead husband had left behind, had finally stopped pretending to care. "Find somewhere else to live," he'd said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "Your debt is too large. Your presence unsettles the other families." What he meant was, "You're contagious. Your poverty might spread." So when old Doña Elodia, the village healer who everyone feared and some respected, had mentioned the abandoned house on Raven Hill, Merv had felt something shift in her chest. Not hope, she knew better than to hope, but something like the memory of hope, the ghost of it, the way a room remembers a fire that burned years ago. "No one will bother you there," Doña Elodia had said, pressing a bundle of herbs into Merve's hands without asking payment, which was how Merv knew the old woman had already decided she was beyond the point where commerce mattered. "The house wants to be empty, so it will keep itself that way." What Merv heard was, "The house won't ask questions. The house won't judge. The house will keep your children alive if it doesn't kill them." The knock on the Tuesday morning was the first sound to break through the silence that had built up in the manor like dust. Merve, who had been sweeping in that methodical way of women who understand that movement is survival, froze mid-stroke. "Hello?" A man's voice, thin and uncertain, coming from the other side of the gate. "Is anyone there?" Merve's first instinct was to hide. Her second was to remember that hiding was a habit she needed to break if she was going to keep her daughters alive. So instead she set down the broom, which was really a bundle of branches she'd bound together, and walked toward the gate. The man standing outside was not the type of person who usually appeared at the manor's entrance. He was young, perhaps 30, with the soft hands of someone who worked with books instead of soil. He wore glasses that caught the morning light, and his eyes behind them held the particular exhaustion of someone running from something, though Merve couldn't determine if he was running toward safety or deeper into danger. "I'm looking for shelter," he said without preamble, as if he'd rehearsed this introduction 1,000 times and was sick of his own voice delivering it. "Just for a few days. I can work for it. I can do repairs, carry water, anything. I need a place where no one will find me." Merv studied him the way a banker might study a contract, looking for hidden costs, for clauses written in the margins, for the fine print that destroys fortunes. "Why would you come here?" she asked. "Everyone knows this place is cursed." He smiled, and it was the saddest smile Merv had ever seen. "Yes, that's precisely why I came here. Because no one sane would follow me into a place that cursed." She should have turned him away, should have closed the gate, should have protected the fragile equilibrium she'd established, her children, the manor, the silence, the precarious peace of being invisible and alone. For the first week, Farouk was the answer to prayers Merve hadn't prayed in years. He fixed the roof. He repaired the doors. He carried water from the well as if his shoulders had been designed specifically for this work. He played with Zainab and Aishi in the courtyard while Merv prepared meals from ingredients that manifested from places she preferred not to examine too closely. Farouk's backpack seemed bottomless in the way that only desperate men's backpacks can be. But it was on the 8th night that everything changed. Merv woke to the sound of her younger daughter, Aishi, crying from the room they shared upstairs. Not the cry of a child experiencing a nightmare, but something more specific, the sound of terror. The sound of seeing something the mind couldn't immediately categorize as real or unreal. She ran, her bare feet slapping against stone that was cold even in summer, and found her daughter sitting up in bed, pointing at the far corner of the room where shadows gathered more densely than they should. There was a woman, Acey whispered, her entire body trembling. There was a woman standing there. She was looking at me, Mama. She was looking and looking, and the girl dissolved into sobs that seemed to contain something ancient, something that didn't belong in a 5-year-old's throat. Merv checked the room. Closets, under beds, behind furniture, nothing. But as she was conducting this inventory of shadows, she saw something that made her own breath catch. Small, wet footprints on the floor, leading from the corner where Aishi had pointed directly to the bed. The prints weren't deep, weren't solid. They looked like they'd been made by something half-substantial, something not entirely committed to the act of leaving evidence. It was a dream. My love, Merve lied, holding her daughter close, knowing even as she said it that she was not protecting Aishi from the truth but merely postponing the moment of reckoning. Just a dream. But she didn't sleep that night. She sat with her daughters. Zainab had appeared, drawn by her sister's screams, and refused to return to her own room and listen to the house settle around them in ways that houses, even old houses, shouldn't settle. Floorboards creaked in rooms they weren't in. Windows rattled, though there was no wind. And sometimes, just sometimes, she heard it. The sound of breathing that wasn't her own, wasn't Farouk's, wasn't any of her children's. The next morning, she confronted Farouk in the courtyard. He was attempting to repair the stone bench that ran along the western wall, working with the concentration of someone trying to solve an equation written in a language he'd never learned. Something is wrong with this house, Merve said, not bothering with preamble. My daughter saw something. There were wet footprints that appeared from nowhere. Farouk stopped working. He remained bent over the bench for a long moment before straightening up, and when he turned to face her, his expression had changed. The exhaustion was still there, but now it was accompanied by a weight that seemed to be pressing him physically into the earth. Sit, he said, gesturing to the bench. I need to tell you what I know about this place. What I came here because I don't think it's a coincidence that I found you here, and I don't think it's a coincidence that things are starting to manifest. I think, he paused, choosing his words with the care of someone defusing a bomb. I think the house was waiting for us. Instead, Merve opened the gate wider. My name is Merve, she said. I have 2 daughters. We don't have much. We barely have enough. My name is Farouk, he replied, stepping through the gate like he was stepping across a threshold into another world entirely. And I'm running from people who want me dead for reasons I'd rather not explain yet. But I will. Eventually I'll explain everything. He kept his word, though not until much later. Not until after the screams started. Not until after the house began revealing its own secrets, darker and more complicated than any curse the villagers had whispered about. Farouk had been a student of history at the university in the capital. He had been researching a disappeared academic named Dr. Karim Demir, a man who'd vanished 30 years ago under circumstances that the authorities had deemed unsuitable for investigation. This was bureaucratic language for, we don't want to know what happened. Dr. Karim had been studying something called the residue of trauma. His theory that buildings could absorb psychological damage the way soil absorbs water, and that under certain conditions, this damage could begin to manifest, to become almost observable. He'd been studying this very house, Farouk explained, sitting on the restored bench while Merve stood with her arms crossed, her entire body a question mark demanding answers. He came here to document what he called the manifestations. He wrote papers about it. Brilliant papers. But then, Farouk trailed off, his eyes going distant in a way that suggested he was looking at something far more distant than the courtyard in front of them. Then what? Merve pressed. Then he disappeared. The university said he'd had a mental breakdown, that he'd wandered into the mountains and probably died. The papers were sealed, the research was archived and classified, and Dr. Karim became a non-person. The kind of person the authorities decided had never existed. What does this have to do with my daughter seeing a woman made of water? Merve demanded, though even as she asked it, she knew the answer was going to be far more complicated than she could possibly imagine. I came here because I had access to his private notes. Farouk continued, as if she hadn't spoken. I found them in the university's restricted archives. I shouldn't have been able to access them. But I did, and what they contained. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a leather journal, its pages yellowed and fragile with age. What they contained was documentation of 17 different entities. 17 different manifestations that Dr. Karim believed were trapped in this house. Women, specifically. All of them connected to disappearances dating back nearly a century. Murphy felt the world tilt slightly. She sat down on the bench unbidden, her legs no longer reliable infrastructure for keeping her vertical. Disappearances, she repeated slowly. You mean women who came here? Farouk said quietly. Women who were seeking shelter, seeking safety, seeking what they thought would be refuge. Women like you. He paused, letting that land. And they never left. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that has weight, the kind that fills a space like water filling a well. Merve wanted to dismiss it, to close her mind the way she'd been trained to close her mind against things that were too large or too complex or too terrifying to acknowledge. But she'd seen the wet footprints. She'd heard the breathing that belonged to no living thing. How do you know all this? She asked finally. And more importantly, why did you come here? Farouk looked at her with eyes that held a complexity of emotion Merve couldn't quite parse. Because Dr. Karim's notes contained a theory that he was testing when he disappeared. He believed that the manifestations weren't randomly trapped here. He believed they were trapped because someone very specific, had done something to this house. Something deliberately, intentionally cruel. And he believed that if he could uncover the truth about what had happened here, if he could document it properly, then... Farouk trailed off, seeming to lose his nerve. Then what? Merve's voice was sharp as glass. Then they could be released, Farouk whispered. Then they could finally rest. The cellar door was behind the kitchen. The kind of door that looked like it had been there so long it had become part of the architecture, forgotten by everyone except the house itself, which had clearly never forgotten anything. Merve descended the stone steps with Farouk following behind, a paraffin lamp casting their shadows against walls that seemed to lean in to listen. The cellar was vast, far vaster than the house above should have contained. The air was cold, not in the way that cold air typically is, but in a way that suggested this temperature had been here for decades, had been preserved like something in a tomb. And then Merve saw them, the marks on the walls. Scratch marks, deep and frantic, gouged into the stone with what might have been fingernails, or might have been desperation given physical form. And beneath them, carved less dramatically but far more deliberately, names. Names and dates. Names and dates and sometimes single words, help. Please, mother, let me out. The list went on and on, covering entire walls, a litany of the disappeared rendered in stone. 37 women, Farouk said, his voice barely above a whisper. All of them recorded in Dr. Karim's notes. All of them disappeared between 1923 and 1967. All of them came to this house looking for shelter. Merve's knees felt weak, but she forced herself forward, forced herself to examine the names as if by bearing witness she might somehow grant them the acknowledgement they'd been denied. And then she found it, a name that made her stop, made her hand reach out and touch the stone as if touch might confirm what her eyes were telling her. Ainur, March 15th, 1952. That was my grandmother, Merve breathed. She'd never known her grandmother, had only heard stories, that she'd run away, that she was shameful, that the family never spoke her name. She disappeared when she was 23 years old. My mother never even knew what happened to her. The family said she'd run away to the capital with a man, that she was a disgrace. Farouk was silent, letting the implications settle between them like a stone in water. Why haven't these names been found before? Merve demanded, though even as she asked it, she understood the answer. This is evidence. Evidence of murder, of kidnapping, of something worse than either of those things. Because, Farouk said slowly, whoever was holding them here worked very hard to ensure that no one would ever look. Whoever built this cellar, whoever maintained this house, whoever kept feeding this place with suffering and fear, they were important enough that when the women disappeared, the authorities didn't look too hard. They didn't ask too many questions. And after enough time passed, Enough years went by. People just forgot. Merv moved deeper into the cellar. And that's when she found the room at the end of the hallway, a room that shouldn't have been there, that didn't exist on the house's upper levels, a room that was perfectly preserved, perfectly maintained, despite the decades of abandonment above. It contained beds, chains, water buckets, and on a shelf, journals. Dozens of them, bound in leather, filled with handwriting that was methodical and precise and entirely devoid of humanity. Merve pulled one down at random, opened it, and felt her stomach contract as she read, Day 47. The woman continues to refuse sustenance. No matter, she will eventually eat. They always do. Her name was Layla. She had 3 children in a village to the south. She told me this without being asked, which indicates weakness. The weakness is already beginning to work through her system like a cure. By day 90, she will have forgotten the children. By day 180, she will have forgotten her own name. By day 365, she will have forgotten that she was ever anything other than this room, this bed, this hunger. Merv dropped the journal as if it had become possessed of teeth, as if it might bite her if she held it any longer. What was this place? She whispered, though she already knew. She already understood with a clarity that made her want to scream. What was this place? A prison, Farouk said. A very specific kind of prison, designed for a very specific kind of captive. Women, Merv said. Women seeking shelter. Yes, why? Farouk was quiet for a long time. Then he reached into the pocket of his jacket and withdrew a photograph, old, sepia-toned, showing a man in formal dress standing in front of this very house. His name was Ahmet Kalkan, Farouk said. He owned this house. He was a government official, a man of some power and influence. He was also, Farouk paused, searching for the words. He had a particular philosophy about women, about control, about what he called rehabilitation. He was a monster, Merve said. Yes, Farouk agreed, but a monster with friends in high places. A monster who was never held accountable. A monster who died in this house of natural causes, and the house just kept what he'd taken. That night, Merve didn't sleep. She sat with Zeynep and Aishi between her, listening to the house breathe around them, and she understood that the breathing had a pattern to it, a rhythm that sounded almost like weeping. Farouk appeared in their room around midnight, carrying the leather journals, his face drawn and aged by exhaustion. I think we need to understand what happened here, he said quietly, sitting on the edge of the bed with care, as if the house might shatter if he moved too quickly. I think the manifestations your daughter saw, the wet footprints, the sounds you've been hearing, I think they're getting stronger because they know someone is finally listening. They know someone is finally willing to see them. How is that possible? Merv asked, though by this point she was beyond the point of rationality. How can the dead make themselves known in this way? How can feelings or trauma or whatever this is, how can it take physical form? I don't know, Farouk admitted. But Dr. Karim had a theory. He believed that buildings are like people. They have consciousness. They have memory. They hold on to the emotions that occur within them the way skin holds on to scars. And this place? He gestured vaguely at the walls surrounding them. This place had more reason to remember than most. Over the following weeks, Farouk began to document what he was calling the unveiling. He filled notebooks with observations of manifestations that became increasingly specific and increasingly terrible in their clarity. A woman made of mist who appeared in the kitchen, over and over again, performing the act of preparing a meal that she had been forced to prepare in life. A woman made of rain who walked the corridors at midnight, leaving wet footprints that didn't fade for hours. A woman made of shadow who would appear at the foot of beds, her presence so heavy and so complete that it seemed to weigh down the very air. Each manifestation was accompanied by a name. Each name Farouk traced to a face in one of the journals. Each face connected to a woman who had come to this house seeking shelter and had instead found Ahmet Kalkan's idea of rehabilitation, which turned out to be indistinguishable from torture. Merv began to understand that she and her daughters had not arrived at the manor by accident. The house had been calling, she realized. It had been calling for someone to hear, for someone to bear witness, for someone to break the seal that Ahmet Kalkan's death had somehow only tightened rather than released. We need to understand what Ahmet did at the end, Farouk told her one evening as they sat in the courtyard, watching the sun set over Raven Hill. We need to understand why the women are still here, why they haven't been able to move on. Something about his death, something about how it happened, something about what he left behind. It's keeping them trapped. So they searched. They found his bedroom on the 3rd floor, a space that was surprisingly austere for a man with such indulgent impulses toward cruelty. His desk contained a locked box. Farrokh forced it open and found inside a single letter, addressed to no one, dated the day before Amit's death, to whoever finds this place after I am gone. You should know that this house is not a prison. This house is a test. The women are here because they are weak, because they chose weakness by coming here, by seeking shelter from a world that teaches women to expect nothing. I am here because I am strong. I am here because I see women as they truly are, as something that requires structure, requires discipline, requires the kind of comprehensive control that only a visionary can provide. When I die, do not judge this place. Do not judge what I have done here. Instead, understand that I have been doing the work that society is too polite to acknowledge needs doing. I have been proving through methodology and repetition that women can be broken, and in breaking them, I have discovered their true purpose. I have left instructions with my associates. The house will remain sealed. The women inside will remain inside, and the world will move on, never knowing what has been proven here, never understanding the truth about the nature of women and control and the natural order that I have spent my life establishing. Do not mourn my passing. Recognize instead that I have transcended the limitations of a single lifetime by creating a legacy that will outlive me. This house is my legacy. Merv felt something inside her crystallize into rage so profound it felt like it might burn through her entire body. He was insane, she said flatly. Completely, utterly insane. And somehow he was allowed to operate with impunity. Because impunity was the entire system, Farrokh replied. Because the authorities didn't question him. Because his friends didn't question him. Because society was built in such a way that a man could do these things and it would be convenient for everyone to pretend he wasn't doing them. The moment came on a night when the manifestations reached a crescendo, so complete and so overwhelming that it seemed the house itself might buckle under the weight of its own accumulated anguish. The women appeared, all of them, or at least the ones that still held enough cohesion to manifest, moving through the corridors like a procession of grief made visible, and they were looking at Merv, all of them, as if they had been waiting for her specifically, as if she was the key to something that had been locked away for decades. Merve felt Farrokh's hand on her arm, felt her daughter's pressing against her legs. But she also felt something else, a pulling, a summoning, a deep and ancient call to understanding. I think, she said slowly, I think I need to go down there. I think I need to go back to the cellar. I think I need to understand what Amit left behind besides words. It's not safe, Farrokh started to protest. But Merve was already moving, already descending, already following the pull that had become irresistible. The cellar was transformed. What had been a room of horror now felt like a room of revelation, the walls seeming to shimmer with light that didn't come from the paraffin lamp Merv was carrying. The names scratched into the stone were glowing, each one burning with a specific kind of intensity, and Merv understood that she was seeing something that existed in a space between physical reality and something far more complex. At the center of the room, beneath a stone that had somehow remained hidden during her first exploration, was another box. This one was not locked. Inside were photographs, hundreds of them, each one documenting an atrocity, each one showing a woman at various stages of what Amit had called rehabilitation, though what was actually happening was something far more specific, the systematic destruction of a human being. Merv's knees gave way. She found herself on the cellar floor, surrounded by evidence of a crime so vast, so systematic, so utterly normalized in its way that it felt not like history but like present tense, like something happening even now in rooms the world refused to see. And that's when she felt the presence most strongly. Not as a ghost, not as a manifestation, but as something trying to communicate, trying to reach across the impossible distance between death and life, between the past and the present, to tell her something. Merv closed her eyes, and she understood. She understood that Amit had built his power on the theory that women who came seeking shelter were already broken, that the act of seeking help was itself a sign of weakness that justified any response. She understood that the house had become a tomb, not just for the women's bodies, but for the evidence of what had been done to them. She understood that the seal that kept them trapped was the world's refusal to acknowledge what had happened here, the mechanism of forgetting that society had deployed to keep such places hidden. But she also understood that seals could be broken. Evidence could be brought to light. The dead could be witnessed. Merv stood up, her entire body shaking, and she looked at the photographs with the eyes of a woman who had nothing left to protect except the truth. It took 3 months for Farouk to contact the authorities. Not the local authorities. They were compromised, connected through degrees of separation to Amit's associates who were still alive, still powerful, still committed to keeping the house sealed. Instead, he contacted journalists, academics, human rights organizations, anyone with the reach and the determination to take evidence so damning that it could not be ignored. The raid on the house happened on a morning in autumn. Police, investigators, journalists, and historians descended on Raven Hill like locusts descending on a field. They found the cellar. They found the journals. They found the photographs. They found the names carved into the walls, names that could be cross-referenced with missing persons reports, with family stories of women who had run away or gone to the city, or simply vanished and were never spoken of again. They found 37 women, 37 records of disappearance, 37 lives that had been systematically erased, and they found something else too, the moment when the manifestations stopped appearing. It was as if, once the seal had been broken, once the evidence had been brought to light, once the world was forced to acknowledge what had happened here, the weight that had kept those women trapped began to lift. The breathing stopped. The wet footprints ceased appearing. The woman made of mist no longer appeared in the kitchen. The woman made of rain no longer walked the corridors. The woman made of shadow no longer stood at the foot of beds. They had been released. Not into peace, perhaps, but into acknowledgement, into the knowledge that someone finally had seen them, that their deaths would not be forgotten, that the house that had tried to erase them had failed. Merv gave her testimony to 3 separate investigations. She described finding Aishi crying about the woman made of water. She described the wet footprints. She described the breathing that belonged to no living thing. She described in precise and unflinching language what she understood the house to be, not a tomb, but a witness. Not a curse, but evidence waiting to be discovered. Farouk's research was published in academic journals. Dr. Karim Demir's name was cleared, posthumously, which was better than nothing, though infinitely more sad. The university that had hidden his work issued statements about institutional accountability and promised to review other sealed archives. Amit Kalkan's associates were investigated. Some faced justice. Some had already died, which the law interpreted as sufficient punishment, though Merv thought privately that they'd gotten off too easy, that they'd been allowed to carry their knowledge to the grave. The house on Raven Hill was not demolished. Instead, it was transformed into a memorial, a space dedicated to bearing witness to the women who had disappeared, to the system that had failed them, to the mechanism of forgetting that society had deployed to keep them hidden. The cellar became a museum. The journals were preserved. The photographs were archived, studied, incorporated into evidence against the power structures that had protected Amit Kalkan during his life. The names carved into the walls were documented, preserved, read aloud regularly so that they would never again be forgotten, and one name in particular, Ainur. March 15, 1952, was added to the family records. Merve's grandmother was no longer a disgrace, no longer a woman who had run away. She was a victim. She was a witness. She was a woman whose name would be known. Merv and her daughters remained in the house, but not as refugees seeking shelter. Instead, they became guardians of memory. Merv gave tours to visitors. She spoke to journalists about what it was like to discover her own family history in a place so dark. She watched her daughters grow up understanding that some houses are haunted not by supernatural forces, but by the accumulated weight of human cruelty, and that bearing witness to such places was not a burden but a responsibility. Zeynep, the older daughter, became a historian, specializing in disappeared women and the systems that hid them. Aishi, the younger, struggled for years with nightmares about the woman made of water, but eventually understood that those nightmares had been gifts. They had been the house trying to speak, trying to reach across impossible distances to say, "We are here. Please, please, look at us." Farouk stayed for 3 years after the raid, helping to document everything, to organize the archive, to ensure that the evidence would not be lost or hidden again. He became something like family to Merv, though they never spoke explicitly about what would happen when he eventually had to leave. Instead, they worked in companionable silence. Two people who understood that some damage cannot be repaired, only acknowledged. When he finally left, called back to university work, to the endless task of excavating history from archives and making it visible, Merve walked him to the gate of the manor, the same gate where he'd arrived all those years ago, asking for shelter. "Do you think they're at peace?" he asked, looking back at the house. "The women. Do you think they're finally at peace?" Merve considered this carefully. "I think," she said slowly, "that they're at rest. Not peace exactly, because peace suggests a kind of resolution that trauma doesn't really allow for, but rest, the rest that comes from being seen, from being remembered, from having the world forced to acknowledge what was done to you." Farouk nodded, understanding the distinction. "Thank you," he said, "for believing me, for allowing me to stay, for having the courage to go into that cellar." "Thank you," Merv replied, "for being crazy enough to search for something no one else was looking for, for being the kind of person who couldn't accept that some mysteries should remain mysteries." After he left, the house settled into a new kind of quiet. Not the silence of abandonment, but the quiet that comes after speaking the truth. Merv would walk through the corridors and feel something different. Not the presence of the trapped anymore, but the presence of the witnessed. The house had been a weapon. Now it was a museum. Now it was a memorial. Now it was a place where people came to understand something essential about the nature of violence and power and the mechanisms of forgetting. On the anniversary of the public discovery, Merv stands in the main gallery of the memorial, watching visitors move through the space with the solemnity of people entering a sacred place, because that's what it has become, sacred, not through religious transformation, but through the weight of testimony, through the commitment to remembering, through the decision to make visible what society had worked so hard to keep hidden. A young woman, perhaps 20 years old, approaches Merv with tears in her eyes. She holds up a photograph from the archive, a woman with dark hair and kind eyes, dated 1952. "This is Aner," the young woman says. "I'm her great-great-granddaughter. I came from the city to see this place, to understand her story. Thank you for not letting her disappear." Merv takes the photograph and holds it carefully, as if it might crumble to dust in her hands. "She's your family," she says. She was always going to matter to someone. The house was just keeping her safe until that someone could finally see her. That night, long after the museum has closed, Merve walks the corridors alone. She doesn't hear breathing anymore. She doesn't see wet footprints. She doesn't feel the presence of trapped spirits desperate to communicate. What she feels instead is something quieter, something more profound. A kind of completion. A circle closed not through resolution but through witnessing. A house that tried to be a weapon, converted into a memorial. A house that tried to hide the dead, transformed into a place where the dead are remembered. She thinks about her daughters, about how they've grown up in this place, how they've learned that some houses are not haunted by ghosts, but by the responsibility of memory. She thinks about Farouk, about the researchers who come here to study the evidence, about the families who visit seeking lost relatives, seeking understanding, seeking the knowledge that someone, finally, has seen what happened to their mothers and sisters and cousins. And she thinks about the question that has haunted her since that first night when Aishi saw the woman made of water. What would have happened if she had turned Farouk away? What if she had closed the gate and insisted on her right to isolation and safety? The house would have remained sealed, she understands. The dead would have remained hidden. The system that allowed such places to exist would have remained invisible, protected by layers of bureaucratic silence and societal forgetting. But because she opened the gate to a stranger seeking shelter, because she was willing to descend into darkness and look at things most people would turn away from, because she chose to bear witness rather than to look away, everything changed. The dead were remembered. The truth was exposed. The house became not a weapon, but a warning and a memorial, and a place where people learned that violence has history, that cruelty has documentation, that the mechanisms of forgetting can be resisted. As Merve locks the museum for the night, she looks at the house from the outside, at its stone walls that hold so much history, so much pain, so much evidence of what humans are capable of doing to one another. and she understands that this is the real haunting. Not the ghosts of the dead, but the haunting that comes from understanding what was done and choosing, despite that understanding, to continue living. To continue bearing witness. To continue being the kind of person who looks at darkness and refuses to look away. The walk back to the cottage on the grounds. He's small keeper's house, where she and her daughters now live. Takes her past the old well where she first drew water as a desperate widow. She remembers being that woman, that person so consumed by survival that she couldn't see beyond the next day, the next meal, the next moment of her children's crying. She remembers not believing in anything except the most immediate mathematics of staying alive. She passes the gate where Farouk first appeared, where she made a decision that changed everything. The gate that could have remained closed. The stranger that could have been turned away. The question that could have remained unasked. Sometimes she wonders if the house called to her specifically. If there was something about her connection to Einar, a connection she didn't even know she had, that made her the right person to find it at the right moment. If the manifestations appeared to her daughters not randomly but deliberately, chosen by whatever consciousness dwells in stone and history and accumulated suffering, as a way of ensuring that the truth would finally be seen. But she's learned not to spend too much time on these philosophical questions. The dead don't need her speculation about metaphysics. They need her continued presence. They need her to show the next visitor where Einar's name is carved. They need her to tell the story, again and again, of how a widow with nothing to lose opened her door to a stranger and changed the course of history. The letter arrives 6 years after Farouk left, forwarded through 3 different addresses, reaching Merve with the kind of cosmic coincidence that suggests the universe is still capable of managing logistics beyond human understanding. Farouk's handwriting is the same, precise, careful, carrying its particular weight of exhaustion and determination. But the contents are unexpected. I have found something else, he writes. Something connected to Ahmet Kalkan. Something that the investigators missed because it was hidden not in the house but in the property records, in legal documents filed in a Capitol building that burns through bureaucrats the way fire consumes paper. Ahmet was not working alone. There were others. There were at least 5 houses, 5 documented houses, possibly more that we haven't located yet, operating across 3 provinces. The same methodology, the same system, the same mechanism of erasure and forgetting, the same complicity of authorities who found it convenient not to see. I'm coming back to the memorial. We need to search again. We need to look for documentation we might have missed. I believe Ahmet kept records. Not just personal journals, but operational documents, evidence of communication with his associates. Financial records showing how money moved through the system. I believe these records are still in the house, hidden in a place we haven't thought to look. I also believe that when we find them, everything changes again. Not just for Ravenhill, but for the entire system that allowed this to happen. Merv reads the letter 3 times, each reading bringing new dimensions of meaning, new layers of implication. She shows it to Zeynep, who is now a published historian with a national reputation for her work on disappeared women. Her daughter's face goes through a series of expressions, shock, recognition, determination, before settling on something that looks like resolve. He's right, Zeynep says. The scope of this is much larger than we thought. If there were other houses, other operations, that means the system was organized. That means Ahmet wasn't a lone predator but part of a network. That changes everything about how we understand this history. Merv contacts the investigative authorities, the journalists who had broken the original story, the historians who have built their careers on excavating this particular piece of darkness. Within 2 weeks, Farouk arrives back at the memorial, and the search begins in earnest. This time, they're looking for something different. Not evidence of individual crimes, but evidence of infrastructure. Not documentation of what happened, but documentation of how it was organized, sustained, protected, and kept secret. They find it behind the walls of Ahmet's private study. A locked room within the locked room, accessible only through a hidden panel that requires 3 specific pieces of architectural knowledge to locate. Inside, correspondence, photographs of other men, maps showing locations of other properties, financial records detailing payments to officials, to police, to judges, to anyone whose cooperation was required to keep the system functional. There are names. So many names. Names of men who are still alive. Names of officials who still hold positions of power. Names of judges and police chiefs and government ministers. Names of a system so vast and so thoroughly normalized that it had been operating in plain sight. Hidden only by the mechanism of institutional forgetting and the world's willingness to look away. This is bigger than one house, the lead investigator says, her face pale as she reviews the documentation. This is conspiracy. This is systemic abuse. This is proof of an entire apparatus designed to prey on women and keep them hidden. The revelation sends shockwaves through the government. Investigations are launched into the other properties. Officials are arrested. Journalists begin excavating the history of 5 other houses, 5 other collections of disappeared women, 5 other mechanisms of silence and forgetting that had been operating for decades. The death toll is staggering. Not 370 women, but over 900. Over 900 women disappeared into a system designed to erase them. Over 900 lives documented in the archives of monsters, reduced to case studies in the methodology of control. Merve watches the investigations unfold and feels something shifting inside the world itself, as if the revelation of such vast cruelty is causing some fundamental reorganization of reality, as if society is being forced to acknowledge something it has spent decades trying to forget. A year after the discovery of Farouk's letter, a conference is held at the memorial. Historians, investigators, journalists, and survivors gather, survivors of similar systems, women who had been held in other houses, women who had been released or who had escaped or who had survived, and carried their trauma into a world that preferred not to acknowledge they existed. For the first time, the stories are gathered in one place. For the first time, they are all told at once, without interruption, without the mechanism of societal forgetting being deployed to silence them. For the first time, the world is forced to understand the scale and scope of what had been done. Merve watches women embrace, watches them recognize each other across decades of separation, watches them understand that they were not alone, that what happened to them was not individual tragedy, but systematic violence. She watches people cry. She watches people rage. She watches people stand in front of Einer's photograph and understand that this particular thread of history connects to them, to their families, to their own understanding of what it means to be a woman in a society that has historically treated women as disposable. Among the attendees is a woman named Seda, who is introduced as a survivor of one of the other houses, House 3, in the southern province, the one that operated from 1947 to 1969. Seda is fragile in the way that people who have been systematically broken are fragile. There are pieces of her that were shattered and never properly reassembled. Gaps in her cognition and memory where the trauma burned through her like acid through paper. But she is also fierce. She is also determined. She is also telling her story in front of journalists and historians, refusing to allow the world to forget what was done to her. I was brought to the house when I was 17, Seda says, her voice steady despite its fragility. I was seeking work. My family was poor. A woman in the market told me there was a job in a grand house, that I could earn money and send it home. I believed her because girls like me have to believe such promises, have to believe that escape is possible. What I found instead was, she pauses, collecting herself. What I found instead was Amit's system operating in miniature. Different location, same methodology, same rooms, same records, same mechanism of breaking a person down until they forget who they were before. She looks directly at Merve. If not for you, if not for someone being brave enough to open a door to a stranger, and then brave enough to descend into darkness and look at what was there, I would still be forgotten. My name would still be in a journal, recorded as case study number 42. But because you bore witness, because you refused to let the world continue its forgetting, people like me are finally being seen. Merve doesn't know what to say. The weight of being thanked for bearing witness is immense, is almost crushing in its implication. She understands that she's become something larger than herself. She's become a symbol, a representation of the possibility of resistance, of the capacity to see evil and refuse to look away. But what she actually says is simpler. I only opened my door. I only went into a cellar. I only looked at photographs and read journals. The real courage belongs to you, to all of you who survived and then found the strength to tell what happened. The trials take 3 years. Justice moves slowly, even when the evidence is overwhelming, even when the victims are finally being listened to. But it does move. Judges who had protected the system are removed from power. Officials who had facilitated the disappearances are imprisoned. The men who had directly operated the houses, those who were still alive, are convicted of kidnapping, torture, crimes against humanity. Amit Kalkan's associates, most of whom had lived out their lives in comfort, protected by their wealth and their connections, finally face consequences. Most are elderly by the time the trials conclude, too old to serve long sentences, but their convictions stand as acknowledgement. The world has finally seen them. The world has finally held them accountable. But the trials also reveal something more troubling. The institutional forgetting wasn't random. It was deliberate. It was systematic. It was part of a mechanism that understood that women seeking help were vulnerable, and that vulnerable women could be disappeared without generating much fuss. The system had created a category of human, unprotected women, women without resources, women seeking shelter, and had made them disposable. Understanding this doesn't bring back the 973 women whose names appear in the archives. But it does something. It creates a record. It makes it official. It ensures that the next time society is tempted to look away from institutional violence, the archive exists to remind people what happens when looking away becomes normalized. It is Merve's daughter, now Dr. Zeynep, with academic credentials and research funding and the capacity to pursue questions that require years of archival work, who makes the discovery that transforms everything again. She's been researching the magistrates who had approved the legal status of the properties, who had ensured that the houses maintained their privacy protections, who had created the legal framework that allowed Amit and his associates to operate with such impunity. And in doing so, she traces the connections back further, back to the early days of the nation-state, back to foundational documents that most people assume were lost or destroyed. But they weren't lost. They were just hidden in plain sight, in public archives that nobody thought to look in documents marked as routine administrative materials. What she finds is a philosophical framework. A government position paper from 1913, circulated among officials explaining why women seeking assistance should be considered a category, requiring special management. A document that explicitly outlines the theory, the same theory that Amit would later implement, that vulnerable women are women who have already failed, who have already proven themselves incapable of survival, and who therefore represent a kind of societal burden that could be redirected or redirected. The document is authored by a man named Mustafa Bakir, a founding bureaucrat in the new nation-state, a man whose career spanned 50 years and whose influence extended into the highest levels of government. This wasn't created by monsters operating in secret, Zeynep explains to Merve, her voice shaking with the weight of what she's uncovered. This was created by the state. This was policy. This was an official understanding, circulated among officials, that normalized the disappearance of women seeking help. Amit wasn't a lone predator. He was operating with the implicit permission of a government that understood what he was doing and chose not to stop it. Merve sits with this information. She sits with the understanding that the system she thought she was fighting, individual monsters and their personal cruelties, was actually far larger, far more systemic, far more normalized. That the house on Raven Hill was not an anomaly but a symptom of a much deeper disease, a disease baked into the foundation of the state itself. What does this mean? She asks her daughter. What does it change? Everything, Zeynep says. And nothing. It changes everything in terms of understanding how this became possible, but it changes nothing in terms of the fact that those women are still dead, that those families still have gaps in their histories. That society still has to grapple with what it decided to do to its most vulnerable members. The revelation of the government position papers triggers a national crisis. The founding myths of the state are questioned. The narrative of progress and enlightenment is complicated by the acknowledgement of institutional predation. Politicians call for investigations into the archives, for a formal government apology, for reparations to the families of the disappeared. Some of this actually happens. An apology is issued, though it takes 5 years and multiple changes of government before it comes. Reparations are offered, though they're never enough. Money cannot bring back the dead, cannot restore the years that were stolen. Investigations are launched into other government institutions that might have been involved in similar systems. But the most important thing that happens is less official and more profound. The narrative changes. The story that society tells about itself changes. The disappeared women are no longer forgotten. The mechanism of forgetting is itself exposed, examined, held up to light. Merv watches this process unfold from the memorial, which has now become a national institution, with funding and staff and educational programs designed to ensure that what happened is never repeated. She watches young people come through the museum and learn about the systematic nature of the violence, about the ways institutions can normalize cruelty, about the necessity of bearing witness even when bearing witness is costly. She watches her daughter become a professor, an expert in institutional violence, a voice that is listened to when governments need to understand how they have failed their citizens. She watches her younger daughter, Aishi, grow up in the house where she once saw a woman made of water and become a therapist specializing in trauma, helping survivors of the system process what was done to them. And she watches Farouk, who stayed at the memorial and eventually married one of the archivists, build a life dedicated to documentation and preservation, ensuring that the evidence remains intact, that the record cannot be rewritten or erased. On a cold morning in November, 20 years after Merv first opened the gate to a stranger seeking shelter, a woman arrives at the memorial. She is elderly, frail, moving with the careful steps of someone whose body is storing pain in every joint. But her eyes are bright, focused, determined. She asks specifically for Merve. "My name is Aiton," the woman says when they meet in the small office where Merve now spends most of her time, curating the archives, answering questions from researchers and survivors. "I was brought to this house in 1948. I don't remember much of my time here. Trauma does that. It burns away memory to protect you. But I remember the courtyard. I remember a wall, and I remember scratching my name into it over and over. Like if I could just leave my name somewhere solid, someone might eventually know I existed." Merv feels her breath catch. "Your name is on the cellar wall," she says quietly. "Aiton, March 22nd, 1948. I know your name." The woman begins to cry. Not from sadness exactly, but from the release that comes from being remembered, from being seen, from having proof that you were never as forgotten as you feared you were. "My children thought I was dead," Aiton says. "My family held funerals for me. They moved on. They built lives around my absence. And then 50 years pass, and I finally escape the fog in my mind enough to understand that I survived this place, that I'm not dead, that I'm still here. And when I heard about this memorial, when I learned that names were being recorded and remembered, I knew I had to come back. I had to see my own name." Merv escorts Aiton down to the cellar. The woman kneels in front of the wall and traces her name with her fingers. Over and over, the same repetitive motion she used to leave the mark 50 years ago, as if touch might confirm that the mark is real, that she is real, that her existence matters. "Thank you," Aiton says finally, standing up with Merve's help. "Thank you for making sure we weren't forgotten." That night, after Aiton leaves, she returns to a life of therapy and healing, connected now to other survivors. No longer alone in her trauma, Merv sits in the courtyard where she once swept leaves, where her daughter once saw a woman made of water, where the mechanism of the house's haunting first began to reveal itself. She thinks about the journey from that day to this one, from desperate widow to guardian of memory, from someone seeking shelter to someone providing shelter to evidence, to truth, to the radical act of bearing witness. It happens on a day when Merve realizes she's getting older, when her hands shake slightly as she sorts through documents, when the stairs to the upper floors of the memorial begin to feel steeper than they used to be. She's been running the memorial for 25 years. She's watched it grow from a local history project into an institution of national importance. She's seen survivors find healing in being acknowledged. She's watched the archive become a resource for researchers and journalists and truth commissions across the region. But she's also starting to understand that her particular role, the role of the keeper, the witness, the woman who opened the door to strangers and followed the truth into darkness, is something that needs to be passed on. Zeynep is ready. She's already working at the memorial part-time, already developing educational programs, already building the framework for the next era of documentation and preservation. Merve begins transitioning her responsibilities to her daughter, teaching her the specific ways of caring for this place, the particular knowledge that comes from having lived here, from having descended into its darkest parts, from having emerged with the truth. "I'm scared," Zeynep admits one afternoon, as they're cataloging a new collection of documents. "Scared that I'll get something wrong, scared that I'll let people down, Scared that the world will find new ways to forget and I won't be able to stop it. Merv smiles. Fear is appropriate, she says. Fear means you understand the weight of what you're carrying. The people I worry about are the ones who aren't scared, who think they can do this work without being changed by it. You're already different because you understand that you're not just preserving history. You're preserving the possibility that the world might choose differently. She pauses, looking at her daughter with a complicated mix of pride and sorrow. When I opened that gate to Farouk, I didn't know what I was starting. I just knew that turning him away felt wrong. I just knew that my own fear wasn't a good enough reason to close a door to someone in danger. I followed the house's darkness into the cellar, not because I was brave, but because I had nothing left to lose, and because I understood that some truths are worth the risk of knowing them. What if it had been a trap? Zainab asks, the kind of question children ask when they're trying to understand how their mothers survived impossible choices. What if Farouk hadn't been genuine? What if the authorities had decided to cover it up rather than investigate? Then I would have been wrong, Merv says simply. History would have been different. You might not have become who you are, but I would still have made the same choice, because the question isn't whether bearing witness is safe. The question is whether bearing witness is necessary, and it is. It's the only thing that matters. On the 50th anniversary of the first revelation at the memorial, a gathering of survivors, families of the disappeared, historians, and journalists assembles at Ravenhill. Merv, now in her 80s, frail but still sharp in her mind, watches from a position of honor as the new generation, represented by Zainab and the other curators and researchers who have devoted their lives to this work, presents new findings, new connections, new understandings of how the system of disappearances operated. But more importantly, she watches families, watches children of disappeared women finally understand what happened to their mothers. Watches grandchildren trace their family histories through the archive, connecting themselves to women they never knew. Watches the mechanism of forgetting being systematically dismantled by the sheer weight of documentation and testimony and refusal to look away. A journalist approaches her during the closing ceremony. "Do you feel like justice has been done?" she asks. The kind of question that journalists ask when they're trying to summarize something too complex to actually summarize. Merv considers this carefully. "Justice would require the return of the dead," she says finally. "Justice would require that this never happened in the first place. I don't think either of those things are possible. What has been done is different. What has been done is acknowledgement. What has been done is the creation of a record that says, this happened. This was systematic. This was normal. And we, the survivors and the descendants and the witnesses, we refuse to let it be forgotten." She pauses, looking at the memorial behind them, the house that tried to be a weapon but was transformed into a witness. "I opened a gate to a stranger," she continues. "I followed a sound into the cellar. I read journals written by monsters. I looked at photographs of women being destroyed. And because I did those things, because I bore witness, the world knows different now. The mechanism of forgetting is exposed. The system has been documented. The dead have been named." She looks at the journalist directly. "Is that justice?" "No, but it's something. It's what remains when justice is impossible. It's the most profound resistance we have against the forces that would erase us." That night, alone in the keeper's cottage where she's lived for 50 years, Merve sits by the window and watches the memorial lit up against the darkness. She thinks about the woman she was, desperate, homeless, willing to risk anything for her children. She thinks about the choice to open the gate. She thinks about the courage that wasn't heroism but simply refusal to look away. She thinks about her grandmother, Einar, whose name is carved in the cellar wall. She thinks about the 973 women whose names are now documented, remembered, honored. She thinks about the homes they left behind, the families they never saw again, the futures they never got to live, and she understands that the real horror of the house wasn't that it was haunted. The real horror was that it was normal. The real horror was that a system existed to make women disappear, to make them forgotten, to normalize their erasure. The real horror was that it took 50 years for the world to acknowledge what had happened. But she also understands something else, that the women are not forgotten anymore, that the mechanism of forgetting has been disrupted, that the next time someone is tempted to look away from institutional violence, the archive exists to remind them what happens when looking away becomes normalized. Merv closes her eyes and feels, perhaps for the last time, the presence that had haunted the house for so long. Not a ghost, not a curse, but a kind of acknowledgement. A whisper of gratitude from the women who were finally seen. Rest now, she whispers to the darkness. You are remembered. You will not be forgotten, and somewhere in the stones of the old house, in the names carved into the cellar walls, in the journals preserved in the archive, in the testimony of survivors, in the knowledge of the world, somewhere in all of these places, the dead find peace. Not the peace of resolution or closure, but the peace that comes from being witnessed, from being remembered, from the refusal of the world to forget what happened to them. The house on Raven Hill stands on the hill, no longer cursed but transformed. And inside it, the work of bearing witness continues, day after day, visitor after visitor, generation after generation, ensuring that the mechanism of forgetting never becomes normal again. Because that is the true magic, the true power, the true resistance. Not the ability to change the past, but the courage to bear witness to it. Not the capacity to bring the dead back to life, but the commitment to ensure they are remembered. Not the illusion that justice is possible, but the understanding that acknowledgement is sacred, that testimony matters, that the truth, however terrible, however painful, however difficult to accept, is always worth the cost of knowing it. This is the story of the widow who opened her door. This is the story of what courage actually looks like when stripped of its romantic ideals. This is the story of how one choice, just one choice to say yes to a stranger, to follow a mystery into darkness, to bear witness to horror, can transform history itself. And it begins, always, with the willingness to open a door.